Welcome, welcome, welcome to another episode of Heated Conversations. Thank you for tuning in. This is part two of doing prehabilitation with Brandi Smith of Perfect 10 OPT. Today, we are going to kind of talk about core and lower back. I know with gymnastics, we focus a lot on our core and our lower back, but a lot of times gymnasts have injuries that have to do with their backs and weak core, and understanding how to work the core as well as complement the back or vice versa, and kind of what causes some of these injuries that we see that happen to in the back. Now come back for the next two episodes that we will do. We'll talk about the knee on the next one, and then we'll talk about the ankle and the foot on the next one after that. Well, thank you again, as I said, for tuning in. Remember to share, to like, to subscribe. Let's tune in with Brandi Smith. Hey, Brandi, how are you?
I'm well. How are you this morning, Peterson?
I'm doing well, doing well.
Nice to
Now,
be back.
yes, thank you. It's cool kind of doing these series and having, I don't know from your end if you've had anybody kind of give you any feedback from the episode we did. I know some people have liked it and kind of shared it on social media and had a few listeners on it. And so I'm hoping this is helpful and, for coaches of any sport, but really in gymnastics specifically, since we're talking, or it relates to us in with gymnastics, and either me being a coach and you being a prior athlete yourself and going through similar, injuries that gymnasts are going through, and you're working with gymnasts. So I'm excited to kind of dive in as we move down the chain a little bit and talk about the core and back. Can you kind of tell us, are the core and back equal in regards to like the amount of time that we're supposed to like work on it? Because a lot of times we do a lot of front side mechanics and not necessarily posterior chain mechanics.
That is a great question. So first of all, to answer that, two things. Well, the first short answer is no. I don't think that they are actively worked equally. And should they be worked equally? Yes. So one thing, there's kind of two different ways we can go about this. The reason the short answer is the way that it is, that I think that we need to work the front and back equally, and that we tend to overwork the front, and that creates some imbalances. I like to think of the body as like a circus tent, and you have a pole in the middle, and there's lines in every direction. If I have a whole bunch of 100-pound billies all around my circus tent pole, my pole is happy, my tent stands upright, it's nice and strong and solid against the forces of the world, right, of the weather. But if I have an 800-pound Bubba on one side and a 100-pound Billy on the other, my pole will begin to lean towards Bubba. And now I'm not withholding against all the weather and the forces externally against the tent. Eventually, that pole will likely fall down, right? Like, or crumble. Now, I have another caveat to that, which is something that we could go into another time because it's another detail, but it's this co-contraction idea where we have too many bubbas, which can happen. And what happens is, like, if you have a pole that's weighted for 1,600 pounds of force, oh no, sorry, 1,600 pounds. You have a pole that's weighted for 1,000 pounds of force, and you have an 800-pound bubba on one side and an 800-pound bubba on the other side. What happens to my pole? Well, it's only weighted for 1,000, so 800 and 800 is 1,600 pounds of force. And so my pole starts to get compressed or crushed, right? And so when we have athletes that co-contract or overly use both sides of their chain a lot, you'll get lots of compression at the joint, very little mobility or range of motion, which is a recipe for disaster because they're not able to absorb any of their shock. And so the absorption goes straight through growth plates, ligaments, depends on their age, right? I think we talked about that a little bit last time. So one aspect is this concept that if we only train the front all the time, and we know our sport requires lots of front activity, right? And our day-to-day, everything, my eyes are in front of me, so everything's in front of me. But if I only train that, then I'm going to get an 800-pound Bubba and a 100-pound Billy, and I'm going to create a recipe for disaster where things are pulling off center. Our body as a whole likes to be in a nice alignment And when stresses and forces are being pulled evenly through the body manages the stress really well. Now, when things get way off kilter, now it's not exact. It's not like you have to be lined up in a dot. Our body can handle a lot of adaptations, right? So we can go a little off center one way or the other, or this way or that, and be fine. And you want to train that. I talk about the pyramid of performance and training variability. You want to train those off-centered things, right? But if all we train is lots of front, then we've now pulled ourselves so far off of what's alignment for our natural body that then we have these abnormal stresses and effects that really they're counterproductive to performance, and then they contribute to risk for injury, increased risk for injury. So yes, you want to work both sides of the chain. And in particular, I feel like the back chain needs to be worked more because you're already training so much front chain stuff innately. Like your drills are all going to be front. Your skills are going to be front mostly, right? Not all, right? Like Tkachev and bridging and back handsprings, you got to use the posterior chain. But if you look at most conditioning, there's a heavy load on the front end. So I think putting some emphasis on the back end on the posterior chain is very helpful. One other piece to that. Now, did that make sense? And does that yeah, it does.
Yeah, makes sense.
Any thoughts or questions or anything before I go on to the next piece?
Yeah, one thing I kind of think about a lot when, especially with posterior stuff, is when I see gymnasts, say we're doing like a plank or something like that, a lot of times where I see weaknesses is in that lower back, right? It sags in that lower back. Now, part of it too is not understanding how to get your hips to roll to really create the roundness in your back, and then also a lack of glute engagement, that also causes that, especially if the lower core is not strong, that lower back will just give and just kind of create this little divot, right? This
Mhm.
little dip. And so really kind of, emphasizing how to create that. Because like, say I'm on bars and we're doing something that I call roller snaps. It's like where you're holding onto a bar, you're laying on your belly, you have the foam roller on your thigh, and you're trying to get into a nice hollow shape, right? And sometimes when they do, the first thing that happens is they'll either pike their feet down or they'll close their shoulders, or if they get into a right alignment, say they're straight, their ribs are in, there's always this dip in their lower back, and I don't think there's as much, we do heel drives and stuff, but heel drives, I think, really emphasize the hips, but also it stresses that lower back, right? And
Yeah,
if you,
if they don't have lower abdominal control, they're just cranking in their back. Yeah.
yeah, and just, trying to really give some solutions for some of those types of things, and to create, you know, balance. And so the kids don't end up having really major back issues. Cause that's like, one of the things that are like career ending is as soon as a kid gets a back injury, especially like starts with stress fractures in the back, pretty soon down the line, they take one bad landing, most of the time, and it just improperly moves up the chain and hits one of those joints or hits one of those vertebrae, um and then their career sometimes is done or very limited.
I absolutely love that you brought up so many things that I'm about to blow your mind about. Okay, are you ready? Are you
Yep.
ready? So first of all, do you want to know why that little dip occurs in the first place?
Yes.
It is an imbalance between the hip flexors and the lower abdominals. So basically what happens is, and so this is where so core is done wrong a lot. And it's not done wrong intentionally. That's 100%. The athletes are so good, especially in gymnastics, but any sport, high level, any sport, they're so good, they compensate, right? And so they'll find a way to get a handstand. They'll find a way to get a heel drive. And however they're going to find it, wherever the weakest link is, that's where they're going to give, right? And so ultimately it boils down to, again, not what you're doing, but how you're doing it, right? You'll hear me say that like 1,000 times, but it applies to all of this. And so in short, what happens is they dominate their movement pattern with their hip flexors, and believe it or not, their posterior glutes, their glutes. So their posterior pelvic floor, we'll talk about this in a second. I'll grab a picture so you can see it. But basically, they'll dominate their movement with their posterior pelvic floor, which is around where we go poop, okay? Just because that's the muscles, and that's why we're going to talk about the anatomy. But right around there, and their glutes will dominate with their hip flexors. And when they do that, they actually kind of, in some ways, shut off the anterior pelvic floor, which is around where we go pee, we go number one. And then the deep abdominals and lower abdominals that actually support the spine, they kind of get turned off by these dominant muscles. So I like to look at it like the bubbas, they want to do all the work. So that's your hip flexors, your posterior pelvic floor, and your glute max. And the billies, they're like totally cool with sitting on the couch, eating potato chips and just chilling and letting Bubba do all the work. And so the lower abdominals and the anterior pelvic floor, around where we go pee, those kind of shut off in a way, right? It's not black and white exactly like that, but it's an imbalance. So what you think about is it's like you have a stiff spring attached to a really loose spring. If I hook them together and then I pull, which spring's going to win, the stiff or the loose one, Peterson?
The stiff one.
The stiff one's going to win, right? So if my lower abdominals are nice and loose and not as active, and my hip flexors are more active, the hip flexors are going to win. The thing is that people don't realize is that the hip flexors actually attach all the way up to a little bit above the belly button. That's where your psoas attaches. You have the iliacus, which is the iliopsoas. You have two muscles, a part of that, and the iliacus is in the hips, the pelvis, but the psoas goes all the way up to L3. And so what happens is it attaches to the front of that spine. And whenever you have, let me see if I can use this dragon. This is a great example. I don't know. Well, your daughter's not old enough yet, but my daughter's very much into dragons and 3D printing right now. So we'll use her dragon. So, but I love this guy. So I'll see if I can, yeah. Okay, so if I have a psoas attached here, and its job actually is to hip flex. Okay, so in the presence of abdominals that are working, lower abdominals that are sufficient and they're equally on the game, right? Then you'll get hip flexion and a curling of the spine, right? Which is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. That's how you get a proper double back or a proper tucking sequence, right? It's also how you're going to get a proper, what I call long hollow, because the deep abdominals and hip flexors need to work together to curl, curl, curl. Now, what happens when there's no abdominal or it's not sufficient, right? The abdominals are not sufficient enough to equivocally balance out the hip flexors, is that the hip flexor attaches to the front of the spine, and what it does is it pulls it forward. So I don't know if you can see this, but it pulls it forward. Now, my guy's not fractured, so he gets stopped by his other spine, which is what should happen, right? But if I do that enough times with enough force, and this is where gymnastics gets in trouble, and cheerleading, tumbling, right? Who are the highest risk for spondylolisthesis, right? They're the highest risk for fractures of the pars interarticularis, where it's just a little spot in the back, right? On the spine. They're at the greatest risk because, well, first of all, running is 5 times your body weight. Tumbling, a back handspring's 5 times your body weight. A standing back's up to 10 times your body weight. Round up back handspring, back tuck's about 14 times your body weight. Elite gymnast tumble 20 times your body weight. If I do enough force of that and what happens is this is not a pattern that happens one time. This is a pattern that happens every single movement they make, every step on their run, every time they bounce on the vault board to punch on the vault board into any vault, every time they land, when they're doing leaps, they're cranking here. When they're doing their giants, they're also cranking here. This is something that happens over time and becomes a dominant pattern. And what we call it is sometimes it's just extension rotation syndrome, sometimes it's extension syndrome. But what it is basically their back at one level will begin to just move at one level more than others. And sometimes it has a rotation component. Sometimes it just goes into extension, which is that little dip that you talked about. So your dip that's happening is happening because of a lack of ability to activate or utilize their lower abdominals and their deep abdominal muscles and the entire central stability system in the presence of a very dominant Bubba named Iliopsoas, who also has some friends like glute max and the posterior part of their pelvic floor. So a lot of these athletes, though, will stand in positions where they actually are just squeezing their butt standing. And what they're doing is they're turning off their abdominals and they're using their glutes to stand. And they're using, so they use all these other muscles instead of their front of their abdominals to activate. Does that answer part of your question, first of all?
Yeah. And kind of going off of the standing part, when gymnasts are like standing in line to hear instructions or anything like that, what would be some recommended positions or even stances to have um, to kind of emphasize that, because sometimes it's you kind of throw in some of these things that might seem minute, but could help them start to engage, in proper position. Because, there's the gymnasts who have that natural just arch in their back or their ribs are out and stuff like that. And so sometimes when they're standing, you kind of, pull everything in, hips under, just to kind of stand tall. So what would you say are some things that could kind of help with that?
Can you see the screen?
I can.
Awesome. So what I want to talk about, this is great because you just described her, right? So these are pretty typical postures for gymnasts. And so one way to look at posture is look at the rib cage like it's a bell, right? And the rung of the bell is the like the pec line, the line where the pecs are. And then the pelvis as like another, you could say a bell or container, whatever you want to call it. But what you want to see is what position is their bell in and how are they standing. So for her, she looks like she has a very excessive, what someone might call anterior tilt, that her pelvis is actually tilted forward, right? But actually, if you look at the alignment of what's called her ASIS and her PSIS, so the alignment of the actual pelvic landmarks, it's actually not tilted more than normal. So normal anterior tilt is about 10 degrees, 10 to 12 degrees, give or take. And that's normal for the natural curve of your spine. Okay. So we actually don't want everyone standing upright into this like straight pencil, right? So if you look at this, her pelvis is actually within that normal range. But what you're seeing that's creating this gigantic arch, this is like an illusion, and a lot of gymnasts have this, is that actually her bell is bell up and her bell is falling behind her glutes. So she's kind of kicking her rib cage up, flaring her rib cage, and dropping her rib cage behind her pelvis. And when she does that, it puts a lot of stress in her low back. Now, this is a girl who had a spondy, who had a fracture of her spondylolisthesis. Now, this is another piece. I'm going to drop this, and then we can talk about it more later. Spondylolisthesis and fracture of your low back is not career ending. It is not career ending. I've got lots of athletes that we've returned back to full sport. And we actually know that 70% of those who have a spondylolisthesis fracture do not ever heal. And they're okay in life. Like they're okay in life. They're okay to go to sports. They're not delicate little fragile beings that we need to take care of. Do they need to work on things and be balanced? Yes. Right? Is there less room for error for them to be imbalanced? Possibly. But if they have pain that's lingering, it's not necessarily because of the fracture. It's probably more due to the fact that there's too much movement and they haven't figured out how to control it. They haven't figured out how to manage that. And so spondylolisthesis, which it's a continuum of injuries. It starts with hypermobility, which means too much movement. Here, I'll stop screen sharing for a second so I can be bigger. But like too much movement at that one segment. And in particularly what we call shearing. So forward backwards movement. Not curling and extending, forward and backwards shearing. So too much shearing movement. So hypermobility is the continuum. So first you have too much movement going on at one segment. And that goes along with this pattern we were just talking about, how they're always dipping, their hip flexors are overworking, their lower abdominals aren't activating. Typically, the glutes actually, believe it or not, are overworking, and the posterior pelvic floor is overworking. And a lot of times they come with what's called a hypertone pelvic floor. So in general, they don't let go. And so it's a matter of teaching the system to work together. Um, so they start with hypermobility, and then once they've moved too much for too long, they end up with a stress reaction because they've now loaded that area a lot more. And then after a stress reaction becomes a stress fracture, um, which stress reaction just means that the body is putting down a whole bunch of little cells called osteoblast, trying its best and darndest to make that bone stronger because it feels like it needs to do something to try to counter the load that's happening that's abnormal. And so this is how smart the body is. And so then when that's not sufficient enough because the forces are greater than the body can keep up with, you get a stress reaction, which just means that you're starting to get cellular breakdown of the bone. Okay. And then if you still are ignoring the pain that has gone on for a while, because pain is information, spondylolisthesis and stress fractures don't happen overnight. Now, you might have a scorpion situation where they land and they scorpion. That's a different scenario. But 90% of them are not those situations. They're this like chronic overtime period where they're growing and doing excessive movement. And then after the stress reaction and the stress fracture, you actually end up with a true fracture, which is a spondy, which there's different levels of spondy. So sometimes there's just a fracture, sometimes there's a little bit of slippage. And if the slippage goes too far, then it is a surgical candidate at some point if it's too far of a slippage, right? But most of your gymnastic stuff falls in that stress fracture, stress hypermobility, stress reaction, stress fracture, and then a few will fall into the actual fracture. And then an even smaller percentage of them will actually have any slippage. The slippage is not a huge percentage of them. And that's the one that everyone's like, I got the same diagnosis. And so then they think it's career ending. Like if I have a grade 3 slippage, probably not going back to gymnastics. I might go back to an active lifestyle, but I'm not going to be going back into wanting to do a bunch of arching and bridging stuff. So, but if you catch it all the way in this other part of the continuum, you just have to retrain things. And they have to, the thing where it gets dicey is when they're growing, their hip flexors get tight. And when that happens, they find a way to continue to do what they're doing. And that's when you want to look for the compensations. So if I'm at a gym, I mean, I look for it everywhere. But if I had to just like hone in and say, I only have time to look at one little thing, I would look at that age range between 9 and 10 up to like 12 and 13 when they have this massive growth period. And I'd be watching them and say, how are they doing in their conditioning? How are they doing their kicks? How are they doing their walking? When they walk, do they do this thing? How do they stand? Like I would just be looking to see, is there lots of movement happening at one segment? And when they're in a leotard, you see a crease right there. There's a crease, there's a wrinkle at that leotard every time they move in that same spot. So I want to, does that helpful, Peterson, so far?
Yeah, yeah, it is.
So I want to go back to this little thing and show you a little bit about that, and then also talk a little bit about what the core really is, and then we can jump into how to work it, because I know you want to do that.
Perfect.
Okay, so you guys see these athletes all the time. They hyperextend their knees. Some of them will throw their pelvis forward. This one is not. I picked this one particularly because this is common, and it's an illusion that her pelvis is actually arched or anterior tilted. It's actually not. It's within that normal range of 10 to 12 degrees of tilt forward, which is normal. But her bell is up and her bell falls behind her bottom. And so this is not a good position to be in. And you can see her ears are in front of her shoulders are rounded forward. All of this postural stuff pretty much shuts off her deep abdominal muscles. And there's some research that shows us at what position the bell works best and what position the bell works the least. So when I say the bell, depending on the position of the rib cage, depends on how efficient and how well your deep abdominals that are going to support your spine will work. Now, do they need to be able to work in every direction? 100%. You need to be able to be in any position and find your abdominals, and any position and find your posterior chain and your glutes, and all of them need to be balanced throughout. Now, they're not going to be exactly balanced depending on the position, right? Different muscles work at different times. Now, this guy here, he's belled down. He's got his bell dropped down, and he's got it also dropped behind his glutes as well. And so we end up with this hinge point in his one little spot here as well. And you can see his ears in a little bit better alignment than hers, but his shoulders are still round forward, but his shoulders are rounded forward because his bell is down. His whole rib cage is dropping his shoulders forward. And he doesn't stand hyperextended in his knees. Now here, so both of these positions are not as efficient for the deep abdominals to be creating stability for the spine. So when you have athletes standing in line like this, they already have their deep abdominals, their central stability system. I don't use the word core as much because it's improperly used. I'm going to tell you what the core really makes up of here in a second. But you know, they're just not as efficient in this position. They did all these studies with EMGs. They poke people with needles to see what muscles work when. And in short, the central stability system is not functioning as well when the bell is up or the bell is down. Now, the bell down position is a hollow. Now, what they did find is that people, when their bell is neutral and their bell falls evenly over their glutes like this, they found that their abdominal and central stability system functioned properly. That they have it's the most efficient position for the abdominals to be found. Okay. Again, you have to be able to use them in all different directions and positions. So you need to practice them in all direction positions. But most people over practice them in a hollow position and they do it isometrically, which also makes not a lot of sense in sports that are dynamic. So when it comes to standing in line, what I do, Peterson, is I actually teach them what I call ram's horns. So what I want to see them do is come all the way up from their feet, all the way up into their head. Now my ear should be a little bit behind, it's a little forward. But what we want to see is that they can come all the way up and into their head. Now, I have a video of this, but I think I'm actually going to just show you because I think it'll be faster. Before I show you, though, how to get them to stand, I want to just take a second to show you the core, because most people all across the country, even the world, when I ask this question, hey, what muscles make up the core? Almost everyone tells me the six-pack muscles. That's the first muscle that almost everyone says. It's the rectus abdominis, the six-pack muscles. That's the biggest one that makes up the core. Here's the thing. This is a shocker. The six-pack muscles do not attach to your spine at all. They attach from your rib cage to your pelvis, and they make your body go into they make you flex, right? They hold in your organs, which are really important. We want them to hold in your organs, but they make you flex. And what we know based on this research is that if I'm flexed and I'm in a bell down position, because basically that's what the six-pack muscle does, it makes you go into a bell down position. It attaches from here all the way down to the pubic bone. And when it pulls everything down. So when the six-pack muscle is overactive, the deep abdominal muscles are actually not active. They're not super active at all. And so overutilization of the six-pack muscles can actually create what we call pelvic floor dysfunction, which actually creates decreased stability for your spine. So I want to show you guys what they have found is that the core is not any one muscle, right? It's actually made up of a system of muscles that works together. And so we have the diaphragm at the top, and it's like a trampoline that goes from the front of your rib cage to the back of the spine, from side to side, right and left rib cage. Okay. And then at the bottom of it, we have a series of muscles. It's not any one muscle. There's a series of them called the pelvic floor muscles. There's multiple muscles in that group, but it runs from your pubic bone all the way back to your tailbone. It does encompass around where we go to the bathroom, both poop and pee. And some of those muscles that help us do those things actually also are part of our pelvic floor and part of our central stability system. We have a transverse abdominis muscle, which wraps from the back of the spine all the way around to the front, to the other side of the spine. We have internal and external obliques. And then we also have our paraspinal muscles and our multifidus muscles, which are these little bitty muscles that run down the little gutter of our back. So you have the spine, and then there's this little gutter, like the, bowling gutters. And if you tighten those muscles correctly, you'll see like a rope pop up out of the gutters. And that is your paraspinals and your multifidus muscles. All of these muscles, when sequencing together, offer stability to the spine and are actually part of your core that are going to counter that hip flexors that like to do way too much, right? And so when these are not functioning properly, you lose stability in the spine. And so here, since we have this nice picture, what we're talking about is that the iliopsoas muscle attaches right here at L3, and it comes down here and it attaches to the hips. And what we were talking about is that if these muscles are not stabilizing and the iliopsoas is working, or especially the psoas, is working too much, it'll pull this spine forward. And that's where you get hypermobility, stress reactions, stress fractures, all of that. And so when you have all of these muscles working together, now when this is all working together, you have this hip flexor. Now you get hip flexion and you get curling, segmental curling of the spine versus that little dip that you were talking about that you see on your planks. They're easy to see in planks, but watch, there'll be a wrinkle there when they go to do their leg lifts. You'll see them drop back and do a little extra extension before they go up into a leg lift. When they get into a leg lift, you will not see a beautiful little curve here. You'll see a curve up at the top, and this will stay flat, or they may even extend here. And those are all signs of someone they've got the movement pattern contributing to what could be a hypermobility. Like the movement pattern happens first. The imbalance in movement pattern happens first before you get too much movement. If you can catch those things in those early phases, you will not have any problems. And so how to do that, super simple. So first of all, any questions? And are you surprised, Peterson? Most people are shocked. Like they're like, this is not what we learned about the abs.
Yeah, I kind of know just because of I'm in school right now, kind of studying this stuff.
Yeah.
But sometimes too, some people have talked about like your core being from like your shoulders to your knees, like all those muscles that are involved in your core. And I've also, learned, that the six pack is not, how you define core strength. And it's really in sports, you have to have, your internal cores and your deeper abdominal muscles having to work. And a lot of times when I train my athletes, I think about those types of things and I work those types of movements and also work on learning how to create stability in the trunk. Like I'll take a band and I'll attach it to like say a beam or a bar and I'll have them sit on a exercise ball and they'll like pull it this way and
Mm-hmm.
then they have to
Like a diagonal? Are you doing like the diagonal
so sometimes it's diagonal, sometimes it's just
straight across?
straight across. But when
That's
they do, I go dynamic towards like their twisting side, so they'll go dynamic. But then they're resisting the band as they come back to work that
eccentric.
deeper. Yep.
Mhm.
So they have to work on their deeper, oblique muscles as well as, their abdominals. So then it's not just, especially when they're twisting, that they can pull everything in tight, right? And have that control instead of just throwing it and then over rotating and have no control.
Yeah, I love that exercise. And that exercise is really great exercise because you're doing cross body work, and you're getting in multifidus and paraspinal. If it's done properly, one thing you want to make sure they're doing is that they're not rotating just from one segment, right? So you want to make sure that you're going segmentally mobility. Just adding an eye movement where you have them actually look for a target and follow the target. Like maybe they're here and they just follow their arms across. The key is that you're then segmentally rotating. And the other key is just making sure that their ribcage pelvis stays connected. So one of the biggest things that happens when they go to do any kind of anything actually is that you'll see right here, if you watch right here, they'll do this. They'll do this first.
Yep.
So that first initiation means that they're initiated their hip flexors. So if I just I tell them this like Legos, I want you to keep your ribcage and pelvis connected like a Lego block, right?
Yeah.
But should be able to segmentally rotate. It just means they need to be on top of each other when they're doing it. So when they're doing the rotation, they're coming up on top of each other and not coming up like this, right?
Right.
That's just one of the keys. And that goes for any conditioning though. I mean, like you can condition the abs and the back in like 5,000 different ways. It's just a matter of, are they keeping their rib cage and pelvis in the same zip code?
Yeah.
I don't want the rib cage and pelvis in a different zip code. If the rib
Yeah.
cage and pelvis stay in the same zip code and they're breathing, those are like two key terms. Like if you just have like, like I said, we could spend, I'll give you a couple little things about planks and other stuff, but you can do 1,000 different, they're all over Instagram, but they're also poorly done. They're good exercises that can be poorly done, right? So it's truly this concept that if you can keep your rib cage and pelvis over each other, and then just keep, keep the movement balanced so that you're segmentally moving and you're breathing, right? Those are two really key concepts. Then you're actually probably doing really well. The problem in lies when they hinge or they move from one segment and they like lock that in. And even just moving from one segment, period. But they'll like hollow, they'll do hollow rocks and they'll lock it in to a little bit, just a little bit of that extension in their low back,
Hmm.
and then they'll rock on that, right?
Yep.
And they're like, I can rock on that all day long. Or they'll hold a hollow hold like that.
Yep.
And what they're doing is they're using their hip flexors, um, and they're using them dominantly over their abdominals. Now, this is not saying that hip flexors are bad. They're not. They're great. They just need to be countered with some deep lower abdominals that are actually helping you. And when you talked about the whole core from the shoulders down to the knees, 100%, you can go to the secondary. I talked about primary. When
Yeah.
you're looking at secondary muscles, it's all about force vectors, right? And so
Right.
you have all these fascial lines and you have all these other, there's lots more to it. But if your primary is not doing the job and you're relying on secondaries, that's when you get in trouble.
Right.
So that's where I think that's why I like to spend a little bit of time talking about the primary core.
And one thing too I do is, since I probably started this maybe like 2 years ago, is when they're doing like hollow work or really leg lifts on the floor, I I have them go to their elbows and I have them like roll their hips under, so then they create a more neutral position. So
Hmm.
then they have to learn what that is first before I lay them flat. Because a lot of times, as soon as you lay them flat, you're going to see that bridge, right? And a lot of times, coaches talk about, hey, try to push your lower back down or push your back down to the floor. And sometimes they can do that. Sometimes they have no idea how to do that, right? As soon as they get extended, um, they it
They
starts to
are.
rise. Yep.
Yeah. And so you could drive a little bitty, matchbox car underneath them, right? Yeah.
Yep. And so
Yeah.
what I do is I have them go on their elbows instead and then roll their hips under, and then we do everything from there. Right. And sometimes I start it, instead of going from a straight leg, we go tuck up position. So then they understand um how to slowly strengthen that muscles without exposing it. Because if we go straight, even from that elbow position with their legs straight, a lot of times they're going to throw their head back. And as soon as their head goes, that lower back goes, at least from what I see, right? And so they'll try to go and do that leg lift and they throw their head back and that they arch. And now it's like that, kind of what you were talking about with the hips, right? Getting outside of that angle to lift their legs, you know? And sometimes they try to almost use like the tug of war mentality where you're like pulling back to get it to like move on the
Go
other
up.
side, right?
Yeah.
Instead of like engaging and just like lifting it from where it needs to. They think if I lean back up this way, it's gonna pull, and yes, it's gonna work because again, they're trying to do what you're asking, but their way of doing it is not always ideal, right?
Yeah. Yeah, because what's happening is they're training more of those dominant hip flexors. That's where you have to be careful. If you don't fix the form in that conditioning, you're going to get kip. So one of the hardest things on a spondy or a hypermobility when they're recovering, coming back, is the glide kip on the low bar, not the high bar, because
Mhm.
the in range of that glide actually puts a ton of force on their low back if they don't have good deep abdominal muscles to help stabilize, because the hip flexors are working so hard to get the legs up. So what I love is you just described the V-up modifications that I recommend. So, I love V-ups. They're great. There's nothing wrong with a V-up. But it's how they're done. They're mostly done poorly where people are extending in their low back. So I do exactly what you just said. I put them down on their elbows and I start with their knees bent and we do V-ups and I make them play with, I'll show you really quick because I make them play with, like you just said, I make them, when they get here, I make them play with this rocking position. I have them rock their pelvis. Like I want you to feel the ends of your sit bones on the floor. Now I want you to feel the back of your pelvis on the floor. And I just let them play with that. until they can find the position. And then I have them use their hands. This is your pelvis, find your hip bone, find your rib cage with your thumb. So with their fingers, find the pelvis, with the thumb, find your rib cage. And I want you to find where they're connected. And I still want you to be open here. Because what will tend to happen is they'll find this connection by doing this, and they'll over round and get into that bell down position. So I want them to find neutral, where their bell is actually just neutral, not down, not up. And then from there, they'll go and they'll do, and we can go from here, like this small movements. And then from there, you can work, can you do it with a longer lever arm? So knees bent, knees halfway bent, knees all the way straight. Now, can we get down here and do it with our knees bent from here, and maybe our hands are helping us, but the thing is teaching them to not curl up, but to teach them to come, let me see if I can do it, to come up this way, right? So that when I'm coming up, I actually have this connection of the ribcage pelvis versus dropping the bell down. And that's just the piece that's really hard. So sometimes I'll say, like, I'll put a sticker on their chest and I'll say, I want you to show the sticker off, but you have to be careful because some athletes, to show a sticker off, they're going to flare their ribs. So It doesn't work with every athlete. What I find really works is just teaching them, this is like two Lego pieces. I want them to stay connected while you do your V-ups, right? And then you can add the arm. And you're just keeping connected. And so you can take that concept, though, to any abdominal work that you do. Because I love V-ups. I have a whole progression actually on Instagram. There's an Instagram where I have a girl going through, she's trying to learn how to do a proper hanging leg lift. And so we were teaching the entire kinetic chain and this pelvic floor stuff. And so we started with her on a decline. So the wedge was actually declined towards the stall bars or a floor bar, holding on. And then we did bent curl ups. And then we did straight. And then we took her into an incline on the wedge, and then to a bigger incline. And then we hung her. And so that's on my Instagram. It's a little fast, but the whole point of it is that she's going kinetic chain by kinetic chain. So we're doing deep abdominals, hip flexors, deep abdominals, hip flexors, instead of hip flexors the whole time. Yep. Without any deep abdominals. The other thing I know you wanted to cover was some planks. So let me pop up this, and so you can do that with I love dynamic stuff there. And there is a place for isometric if you're trying to like find something, like they don't know how to find neutral, right? That's a good thing to be. But the problem lies that we do so much isometric that we're kind of, it doesn't make sense because we're a dynamic sport. Okay, so I wanted to show this. This goes along the lines that I believe that we were all born to move and that we just mess it up later. So this is not my daughter. This is one of my teammates' daughters. And she sent me this. And I was like, dude, can I please use this? Because look, she's looking at mommy take a picture, right? But ultimately, ear, rib cage, pelvis, all in this beautiful alignment. And no one taught her to do a plank. No one taught her to do a plank. This was just natural movement. And then we go and try to mess it up. I honestly think that we just train things in the wrong direction. So I laugh because I had to show that, because we are born to move and we already innately know these things. So I wanted to talk about, like you talked about, here's that saggy plank that we all know is bad, right? This is a picture of a saggy plank. And you can see there's this one little point where it's dropping. Now here's the plank that I see everywhere, but I also see the arms locking in with their fists usually together. They make fists, they bring their fists together. And what they're doing is they're compensating with their pecs. And so that's a pec compensation, to bring their fists in like that. And then when they over round up here, they're squeezing their bum here to get an increased tilt, and they're using lots and lots of hip flexors and not a lot of abdominals. So what you want to see is ear, shoulder, rib cage, pelvis, a natural little curve, which is about, like I said, 10 degrees, give or take. It's just a natural little curve. And then they should be able to breathe and maintain this. Now, the research shows that if you're holding a plank longer than 30 seconds, you're going to be dominated by hip flexors. So after 30 seconds, no matter who you are, elite level, whatever, your hip flexors will begin to dominate the movement pattern. And so for me, I only hold planks as long as they can maintain this shape. Once they start to, tuck their tail more or round in their upper back or they get saggy, then we're done. And what I do is I don't let them be done. I call them burnouts. I have them drop their knees directly down where they are and finish out the 30 seconds. Finish out however long we decided we're going to hold. But I want you to finish it out with proper form. So when they drop their knees down, they get a chance to reset their form, and then they finish out their time. Because to me, it's more important that I don't train that dominant hip flexor pattern and that I train proper alignment and breath work and deep core, because that's my goal of the plank. It's not about how long, so I think we sometimes get confused, oh, the goal is to make it in a minute. It's like, well, anyone can make it in a minute in any shape, but that's what's going to carry over to your sport.
Right.
Whatever shape you train them in that 1 minute is what their handstand is going to look like. 100%. I've seen thousands of athletes. That's what's going to happen. And so I have to ask you, are you ever going to be able to open your shoulders fully if you have this rounded position of a over hollow into a handstand? Will you ever be able to get your hips fully open? The answer is no, because when the rib cage is rounded like this, your shoulder blades are blocked and you cannot get your arms all the way up. Now, you can if you take more from the shoulder joint itself. And now we're talking about instability of the shoulder and other problems. So if you even just try it right now, Peterson, if you tuck your rib cage down and kind of slump in a really bad posture, try to lift your shoulders up as high as you can. How high do they go?
Not so high.
Not so high. But if you open up your rib cage and now open your shoulders, they go all the way. You're a little tight in your terries, that's all.
Yep.
Do a lot of weights and a lot of coaching. But does that make sense? So I question when we're asking people to do lots and lots of isometric hollow holding, and we're even training lots of drills, asking them to do over hollow. And I'll call it over hollow because it's not a long kinetic chain hollow. I'd like to see, back to my dragon, the entire kinetic chain go into our hollow position, because that's actually the shape of a giant tap, is that shape. But when you look at an actual handstand all the way straight, if you want to be straight into a handstand and pirouette or blind or anything else out of it, if you're a little hollow, you're going to be off-centered and your axis will go in a different direction. So it's a matter of finding straight body. And if you look at the code of points, the most common position, even though I ask all across the country, it's finally starting to change. But for years, if I would ask what's the most common shape, and I asked this in one of my favorite, I teach 2 shaping lectures of my favorite lectures, and they're fun. But I ask across the country, what is the most common shape in gymnastics? And notoriously, everyone answers hollow. And I pull out the code of points. In that slideshow, I have all the code of points pictures. I'm like, look again at her torso, full turn, setting for a back tuck, giant swing. What is she at in the handstand? What actually happens on the fall? What actually happens on the tap? Your Chanko vaults, the entry to exit. Once we get past the long arch, what do we hit? What are we in a hurdle? What are we in? They're all straight body positions. And I've talked with Gerald George, and we've had lots of conversations. And he said, in reality, if you're doing the gymnastics in ideal biomechanics form, there's only an 8-degree change in shape. So it's a straight body to an 8-degree change of a long arch, a straight body to an 8-degree change of a long hollow in most skills. Now your legs and arms vary. But if you're looking at the torso, that's the reality of it for ideal biomechanics. So we also know, we go back to this pelvic floor dysfunction, which also contributes to urinary leakage in gymnasts and cheerleaders with vaulting, running, and tumbling, and trampolinists. So there's a study that 70% of trampolinists have urinary leakage with trampoline. And then in 2012, 50% of the women's artistic Olympic team, they reported that they had urinary leakage with vault and floor. I've gone into gyms where the entire team that are optionals above the age of 14 all had leakage. So the thing is that if we know that if the bell is down, we're turning off our deep abdominals and we're increasing forces through like inner pressure forces through our pelvic floor system, we're going to have a blowout, which is urinary leakage. And if this is not a common shape in gymnastics, and when you talk to the most known biomechanics, and when you think about transferring of loads, it doesn't make a lot of sense. I like to pose the question, why are we overtraining isometric hold of a hollow position? And it really is, if you look at all the shaping that I'm seeing on like these drills where you snap down and land into a hollow on a wedge and all these other things, and these excessive hollows going into a round off. And I talked to Jerry, I said, hey, like, why are we doing this? And he said, I don't know. He goes, someone made it up somewhere. He goes, but someday they're going to figure out it's wrong. And I said, yeah. But he said, I said, I think they're thinking that they can shorten the lever arm to turn over faster. And he said, yes, but at a cost of leaking all that power. He says, you're not actually turning over faster. The thought of shortening a lever arm makes sense. However, you're doing it at the cost of the loss of the pelvic floor and the deep abdominals. You're also losing power and stability as you're going in. So this really excessive, because the other problem is they're not doing kinetic chain. It's all one segment. So you're moving one block on top of another. Basically, that rib cage is over rounding on top of a straight or arched low back, a lot of times arched. So this is part of the reason I question why we're doing so much isometric hollow and not looking at entire kinetic chain stuff and not looking at breath work and the entire central stability system, looking more at like transfer of loads when we're looking at training the core and dynamic, even drills for skills.
No, that's good. That's good. Yeah,
Um,
because a lot of times, because I as you're talking, the that over hollow plank is kind of what I've, have taught, to be quite honest. But a lot of
mhm,
times is I don't necessarily let their hips I tell them to press their hips down, so it's a little bit more neutral instead of
mhm,
creating that. But as I talked about in that roller snap drill, to kind of remove that arch that's in their back, I do tell them to kind of almost like so they get up to this position and their back is like around up here and to kind of remove that, just to kind of let it lift up here a little bit. So then it takes this stress off of that lower back, right? And
yeah.
so it's good because what you're saying makes sense in regards to like having to with that first plank where they're a little bit more neutral and they have to actually engage their core because I can hide unless I'm breathing deep, like if I do over hollow plank, I can I can negate the core engagement,
Mhm.
because I'm hiding behind everything else, right? Like I'm hiding
Yeah.
behind my pecs, I'm hiding behind my lats and my traps and all that. And
And your hip flexors. Yeah.
yes, and my core's not engaging unless you tell them to deep breathe to deep breaths, and every time they do, they're actively trying to contract their abdominal muscles, right? But the other one stresses, I feel like, because I feel as though you're having to fight the force of gravity a little bit more, right? And actively think about that, where it's almost like you're trying to go up on your like an over hollow, you're just kind of like going up. Like if someone's trying to poke you, you're just like, okay, I'm getting out of the way, right? Where
Yeah. Yeah.
like if someone's trying to poke you, you're trying to like take the impact, you're going to be a little bit more neutral to actually engage. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Well, there's a couple things I could do for you. So one, I could show you how I teach plank and how I help them find that neutral position. And then we can talk about all the fun things you can do out of that, right? Like there's a ton of planks. I've got a couple videos we can drop in of like the side plank, and then one of my favorite ones was challenging is a sunflower. It's very dynamic type plank. There's a lot of dynamic planking you can do once you've learned a plank position, right? The other thing is that I've worked with, matter of fact, just recently I had a coach, we had talked about, so in my Invincible Athlete program, we did a whole 5 weeks on the core. And we went through all kinds of exercises from like the basics, how to find it, all the way to the core, to the planking and how to make planking fun and crazy, and then also up to dynamic core. And what that looks like in skills drill. It's hard to do this all in 1 hour, but like, we went through this whole very thorough way of how to mess with your core and how to find it, right? And it was a lot of fun. So one thing though that he had a bunch of level 3s that had these saggy handstands, and he had been doing that exact same drill you were doing, which is, he had them do the roller plank, put the foam roller underneath it. He says, and they just struggled, and he still wasn't getting what he wanted out of the handstand. And so I said, hey, why don't you help them find straight body? I think they don't know. So most athletes don't actually know what straight body is. So we use the floor and we flip them over. And so I can show you really quick. Do you want me to show you that really quick and then
Yeah,
show
let's
you
do it.
how to do the plank? Okay, we're
Yeah.
over, but it's all right. This is great stuff. This is great stuff. Okay, so there's a whole series of how I get here, okay? We go through this whole series of playing with our body, right? We do this rocking with our pelvis in a frog position. Most athletes will put little pit blocks underneath there, and they just rock their pelvis forward and backwards. And I tell them things like, and some of them cannot do this. So you have to use all kinds of fun cueing. Sometimes you have to tell that, sometimes I have to put them on an incline to get them to find it. So I put their head on the incline and their bottom down on the floor. And I'll tell them like just to rock your pelvis forward and back, and they're like, can't move it. I'm like, okay, think about breathing in and just rolling your pelvis forward. And now I want you to imagine you have a monkey tail and it's attached to your tailbone. I want you to pull your monkey tail towards your head so that your tailbone has to rock. Sometimes I have them to tuck their tail. I'll say something like, I want you to imagine you have a frozen wetsuit on and you're trying to get away from the frozen wetsuit. And then you're going to relax. Or maybe you're looking at your leotard and you're going to say, okay, I want you to stretch the leotard out so it's tight. And then I want you to make wrinkles in your leotard. Stretch the leotard, make wrinkles in the leotard. So these are all different cues I'll use. And I'm going to tell you, you're going to need all of them. So if you get 10 kids out there, you're going to have 3 that just like, you're like, pulling your hair to try to get them to rock their pelvis because they've never done it. And they don't know how to separate their pelvis from their rib cage. So it's very important to separate the segment so that you can figure out how to control it. So this is step 1. And then once we've done that, we start adding like marching. But they don't. So what they have to do is they do that breath in. And I want them when they breathe in to open their rib cage in every direction like an umbrella. And I want to see their abdominals relax. And that's hard for a lot of athletes. So when they breathe in, their belly should expand a little bit, but I'm not focusing on the belly because I don't want to push their belly out. I just want their rib cage to open like an umbrella and everything's kind of relaxed. So then when they breathe out, I'll say, okay, do your monkey tail, or pretend like you're putting on tight jeans and you're trying to zip them up, or get away from that frozen wetsuit. And you figure out which cue works the best for them. There are other cues, but those are the main ones. And so they do that first. Inhale, exhale, monkey towel or frozen wetsuit, and then just lift one toe and then the other toe. And their pelvis has to stay neutral, no movement, no rocking of the pelvis. Their hands, as you notice in this picture, are on their pelvis to watch them. Now, if they can't do this flat, I'll put them on an incline to start. And then we do bent knee fallouts where we have one leg where it like rotates out to the side and back in. And they're just spinning. I tell them to spin inside their hip socket like the hot dog roller at 7-Eleven. Everyone knows about the hot dog roller at 7-Eleven that keeps the hot dogs warm. I want their legs to roll like that inside their pelvis, right? But again, same thing. Inhale, exhale, and on that exhale, they're either monkey tail, pulling their monkey tail up, or they're getting away from that frozen wetsuit, and then they send their knee out to the side and back up, and they're working their breath the whole time. Find a rhythm. And they want to only go out with their leg as far as they can before their pelvis comes off the ground. So we're looking at the pelvis staying connected and neutral. In short, the pelvis and rib cage are in the same zip code. They're connected, right? And I will start using the word connected. So instead of using words tight, when I start training handstands, if I can, springs and other things, I'll say, I want you to inhale, and get connected. And so on their exhale, that means this stuff. So I start using cueing throughout these little exercises to get what I want later. So I can use the same cueing when I'm teaching a handstand or whatever the next skill may be. So then I want to teach them heel slides. Now, this one, she had to have something underneath her head. Sometimes I have to put them on an incline. Sometimes we can put them all the way flat. And she's not monitoring her hips. So she should be monitoring her hips. Hands are on her pelvis. And she does that inhale through the rib cage in all directions. As she exhales, she does the monkey tail, or she gets away from the frozen wetsuit. And then I want her to think about, like, there's a ball of light in her pelvis, and I want you to send the light out your toes so that the light is just lengthening their legs. And then I want them to take a nice breath when they get to the end and see if they can let more light go out or let the leg go down a little more. Our goal is to go right leg back up, left leg back up, right leg down, left leg down, so that they end up with both legs down at the bottom. So that they can figure out how to control their rib cage and pelvis and that lower abdominals while lengthening the hip flexors. This is a handstand. You have to lengthen the hip flexors to get an open handstand. If you're relying on a shortened, contracted hip flexor to stabilize your spine, you will never get a straight handstand. You will always have a pike, and you'll get that deduction. And you'll be really struggling to get anything out of that handstand as far as pirouetting, twisting, these, your axis of rotation will change. So then I have them do their arms. Same thing, right? Exact same setup, one arm over the head, down, other arm over the head, down, right arm, left arm, both over the head. So that we're working on how to open our arms without flaring our rib cage, right? And then we go into a straight body handstand. So he went through this drill really quickly with his guys. You can actually teach them fairly quickly if they can manage the control. Now, if they're all over the place, it might take a little bit. You might have to stop at one point or another. But really quickly, this coach I just worked with, he taught his level 3 boys, so these are young guys, to get into this straight body position. So he said, so you're going to inhale, exhale, monkey tail, one leg out, other leg out, one arm up, other arm up. Breathe and gently press into the ground. So they're having to activate at the very end of it a little bit of their posterior chain. And so he did this, and he said he had 10 guys, and he was like, 8 of them got beautiful handstands that he had been fighting doing the other direction. And he's like, just blew his mind that we flipped them over. And I said, but what we did is we used the floor to help them have a starting point of what is a straight body. When you flip them onto their stomach, that's more advanced. To find a straight body on their stomach and then pull up into a roller, that's more advanced if I have no starting point. So once they have this, then they probably would be able to find that other position. But you have to ask, are they able to do it without over activating their hip flexors? Because then it's going to counter your handstand purpose. Does that make sense?
Yep.
What do you
Yep.
think? What do you think about that?
No, I think it's good because again, it debunks some of the things, at least for me personally, that I think because again, it goes back to we work the front side, the anterior, chain more than we do our posterior chain, and making sure that we're understanding those things and trying to work more on our, using our posterior chain to help get into proper alignments.
Yeah, I love when you get into that straight body and you have the floor behind you, have something to push into so you can activate the posterior chain a bit. And what's really great about that is that when you get into that handstand, you need that posterior chain active while this is active to just go up.
Right.
All you want in a handstand is to go up, not forward or back in any direction,
Right. Yep.
Um, so I don't know if you want to, but we can real quickly go through the couple little core plank things. I can show you how I teach a plank, and then I can show you the side plank, and then we can just do a real quick talk about how to. I have 2 whole sections actually on planking. I have 2 videos on my Facebook group, in my Facebook page, Planking 101 and Planking 102, I think, which is a whole series. I think they're both 10-minute videos or something like that, but they go through the whole process. But you can literally do anything out of a plank. So do you want me to go ahead and just show that piece really
Yeah,
quick?
really quick. Yeah.
Okay. So in short, I always have everyone start on their elbows, and then you can work yourself to a high plank. I find it easier to teach a low plank first. And then when I teach a low plank, I want to make sure that their elbows are underneath their shoulders and their hands are straight forward. So I take away this whole pec stuff and I make their palms go down. So now they're having to push away from the floor instead of that digging in. And then from here, I let them kind of play with like this, cat-cow situation where they can kind of find what moves. And then I want them to find that position where their ear is in line with their shoulder, rib cage in line with their pelvis. And then from here, and it doesn't matter who you are or how long you've been doing planks, I start you on your knees. And then I find that connection and I want you to press tall. And your crown of your head is going towards the wall. And then you're going to breathe into your rib cage like it's an umbrella. Breathe out. Do that little monkey tail or zip up, or get away from the frozen wetsuit. Put one leg out. Now I let them have about 10 inches between their toes, so that their feet are a little wider than together, not all the way together, because adductors, the hip adductors also like to counter the abdominals. And then I just have them open up and stay connected. And I have them breathe in this position. So it's this nice open hollow position. And I have elites who come in and say, I can hold a plank for 8 minutes. I put them here and they make 5 seconds and they're dying. And so make sure they're breathing while they're doing this. And then when they start to sag or they start to round, I drop their knees down right where they are. And I help them find that position again. Breathe. And just breathe. And I let them burn out from there. And that's really the concept. That's a basic plank. And then from that plank, you can do all kinds of things. Like you can come from here and you have everything open and you can do knee bends. Now the problem is when they do their hip flexor, they'll do this. They'll flex the knee towards the ground instead of keeping the pelvis and hip connected. So they have to stay open and bend the knee. What I don't want to see is I don't want to see arch, right? I don't want to see that. So they have to stay open and connected. And we can do alternating. We can do arms. You can do arm and leg together. You can get into a high plank or even a low plank. You can start doing the drags. Like there's so many things you can do from planks, right? So you get in the plank, you drag the weight across, you drag the weight across. You can do like, oh, I love side planks. There's so many things you can do in planks. You can do rotation stuff in planks. Like I love planks and I love dynamic planks. They're one of the great ways to get the core going. Just real quick, I'll show you a side plank. This is, so this right here.
So in this position,
is the beginning phase.
Bring your head back more. Oh, that's pretty close. Bring your head back.
Turn that off. So here we have her head needs to come back a little more. This is cell phone neck. But yeah, there she goes. So ear, shoulder, rib cage, Bella's in neutral, and she's pressing up. Now, one of the biggest mistakes people make on a side plank is watch her shoulder blades. They don't move. So when she presses up, this is not wanting to move, and she shoves her shoulder forward. So this is going way forward right there, and this is not moving. So what should happen is the whole shoulder blade should move out and the shoulder should stay steady, not like it shouldn't be moving separate. That shoulder should stay centered in the socket and the entire shoulder blade should come away from the spine. When you do, see, this wants to go down. I don't know. I think she got one good one at the end. That was better. So that was where this stayed more centered, but you want to see it even more goes down and out. Now you can see her neck is dropping forward in that cell phone neck. So you want that head to be a little further back. Yeah. And so you want to see everything in a line. So right now her head is forward. It still needs to come back. She's fighting cell phone head, the cell phone neck. Let's see if she goes. Yeah, that one was better. So we want more shoulder. Yeah, so she's able to do it better on this side. So you can see how on this side, the shoulder blade comes away and the shoulder stays centered.
Yep.
And so this side plank is not only just everything staying in alignment like this, right? see what we can do here. And we can add the arm up to make it a little harder. You can straighten the knees out and then add the arm up to make it even harder. You can do circles with the arm one way or the other. You can do resisted band pulls if you want. But the key is that their ear, rib cage, and pelvis stay in alignment, and that when they press up, their shoulder blades should go away from their spine. So that's one of the biggest things that gets messed up on a side plank. So here is something that's super fun, really hard to do. I never do more than like 3 to 5, but this came from CrossFit, and I love this. It's called sunflowers. And when you're doing a sunflower, you put one hand in the middle. So you put one hand in the middle of your body, and then your feet are out really wide. And then you find that straight body plank, and one arm is 90 degrees out, and then you rotate up straight. Then you rotate back to that 90, and then you rotate all the way under, and then back to 90. And your feet should be rotating with you. So I do this from a couple different directions so that you can see it. But you want to open up the rib cage and find that nice plank position, rib cage, pelvis in alignment. And then everything rotates together and rotates under and then back up. It's a really fun, like functional planking exercise that works everything. So it's not any like one muscle, it's the whole system. And you're having to stay connected. And it's super hard. So like 3 to 5 is all you really need to do. And then we did some more with her. But that's just a couple different fun ways to like progress your planks and do fun things. But again, it's not what you do, it's how you do it, right? So the key is really making sure, so if I had take homes for this, rib cage and pelvis are in the same zip code. You're able to breathe, right? And that once you've found this neutral position, you train going in and out of it dynamically. So like I even like log rolling, where you go into what I call a long hollow though. It should be the whole, it's not this excessive rounding in the rib cage. It's the whole chain, a long hollow, roll, long Superman arch. So that's the other piece we didn't get to cover today, was the Supermans. I love to do Supermans, but they're done improperly a lot, where they let their low back drive down. So I lay them usually on the Bosu ball, or you can put like some towels underneath them. But I want to use an entire chain. And you want to see the entire chain, like my dragon here, entire chain extend, right? So that they lift up. And so when you first start with the Superman, you might make it easier by lifting with your hands crossed. And then you could go behind your head, then you can go arms out. And if they can't get up, you can put arms underneath them to help them. That's the easiest. But the key is that the rib cage and pelvis stays connected when they go into the lift of the Superman. Are you familiar? Do you know what I'm talking about? Does that make a good enough description?
Yep, I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking time to kind of talk about, ways to be able to help us improve in our core strength, really our deeper core, to help our athletes, one, to prevent injuries, but also to withstand the forces that they are putting on themselves, right? And to have a longer career that is healthy, at least from the physical therapy side or from the biomechanics side. And, for us in educating coaches and how to teach our athletes properly. So I appreciate that. And thank you everybody else for tuning in to another episode, as we kind of talked about the core and the back and kind of how they relate and ways to really train, and more specifically, just kind of talking about different planks and variations and stuff like that. Tune into the next episode that we have, as we talk about the knees and talk about the ankles. And we might also do another one where we kind of show how everything all relates. And so then we can kind of make this all encompassing and kind of give you a bonus episode. So thank you again. I'll see you guys in the next episode.